What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our wide receiver rankings for week 14 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content or find it helpful, hit that like button on the way in. And if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing as well. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and subscribe to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Before we hop into today's video, I just want to specify these are purely week 14 rankings. These are not rest of season rankings. These are not overall rankings. We are purely looking at week 14, including the best potential matchups, the best potential game scripts, as well as production up until this point while we go through today's rankings. But without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, I've got Justin Jefferson, your wide receiver 4 so far on the season. He gets a great matchup against the Detroit Lions, an important matchup within this division for both of these teams, and the Lions have not played very well overall as a defense, although they've looked better in the past couple weeks. I still expect Jefferson to have a big day. It's worth noting his worst fantasy performance of the year so far was week 3 against the Detroit Lions, but I just expect him to bounce back here in week 14. I think he's going to have a very good day. 18.6 fantasy points in week 13 for JJ, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 45 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Since week 8, he has had a touchdown every single game except for weeks 8 and 11. I just expect big things out of JJ this week and a good overall game script against the Detroit Lions. Moving along, we've got Davante Adams against the Rams. Adams is just playing phenomenal football. He looked ridiculous in week 13 against the Chargers. 37.7 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 177 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. He comes in as your wide receiver 2 so far on the year, and ultimately he may draw a little bit of a tough matchup with Jalen Ramsey presumably on him for most of the day, but Ramsey struggled last week at the end of the day against DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So I like Adams. He's matchup proof. He just looked insane last week, man. Him and Carr really look like their chemistry is really coming along. I don't know if it's going to mean much for the Raiders season, but from a fantasy perspective, Adams has to be in your starting lineup. You could definitely argue that Adams could be our wide receiver 1 as we approach the week. He is just playing phenomenal overall. I've got him as our wide receiver 2. Moving along, I've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's moved up to wide receiver 6 so far on the season. He gets the Vikings. Once again, I just like this matchup. Both of these defenses have played well at points throughout the season, but ultimately, I just expect a good day out of both offenses. I expect a lot of points to be thrown around in this game. 34.6 fantasy points in week 13 for Amon-Ra St. Brown. That is actually only his second highest total, believe it or not. 39.4 in week 2 was his season high. 12 targets in week 13, 11 receptions, 114 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. In his last 4 games, he has 15 or more fantasy points, a good game script, a good matchup. Ultimately, Amon-Ra St. Brown should have a baller day. Moving right along, I've got Tyreek Hill as my wide receiver 4 here in week 14. He comes in as your wide receiver 3 so far on the season. He gets the Chargers, a team that Davante Adams just made look incredibly silly the past week, right? And honestly, Tyreek Hill could be higher than any player on this list. When we look at these honestly, the top 10 receivers going into the week, any of these guys could finish in front of one another. All these guys are playing incredible football, and Hill especially looks scary right now. 29.6 fantasy points in week 13 against a very good San Francisco 49ers defense. 14 targets, 9 receptions, 146 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I expect another monster day out of Tyreek Hill, who's having a phenomenal season here in week 14. Moving right along to our wide receiver 5, I've got AJ Brown. I really encourage you guys to make sure AJ Brown was in your starting lineup. He was a must-start player for us last week. I rode the revenge game script all the way, and man, did that one come true. We had him pretty highly ranked last week. He finished with 31.9 fantasy points, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 119 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns against his former team. That was his second best fantasy performance of the season. I expect another big day out of AJ Brown in an important matchup against a divisional rival in the Giants. Moving right along to our wide receiver 6, I've got Stefon Diggs, who comes in as your wide receiver 1 so far on the year. So you could definitely argue I have Diggs too low, but I see a little bit of a higher ceiling for the 5 receivers in front of him. When he played the Jets in week 9, he had 14.3 fantasy points. So, at the end of the day, Sauce Gardner is for real. The Jets defense knows how to limit even some of the best offenses within the league. But like we just talked about with Tyreek Hill, I will not be surprised if Stefon Diggs finishes in front of any of the receivers I have in front of him. 22.2 fantasy points in week 13 against the Patriots, 9 targets, 7 receptions, and a touchdown with 92 receiving yards. He has 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Stefon Diggs is playing phenomenal football. Your wide receiver 1 on the season, my wide receiver 6 going into the week, but I expect him to have a baller day. Moving on to our wide receiver 7, I've got Jamar Chase against the Browns. I encouraged you guys last week to start Chase if he was on your roster. He showed up for us, 16.7 fantasy points in his return from injury. Missed the last 5 weeks, including the bye week in week 10, but ultimately still had 8 targets, 7 receptions, 97 receiving yards. This is Joe Burrow's favorite target. An important divisional game against the Cleveland Browns, who the Bengals lost to in week 8. I expect a lot of volume for Jamar Chase. I expect a good stat line out of Jamar Chase, simply put, on the week. Moving along, I've got DeAndre Hopkins as my wide receiver 8. He's playing great football on bye week in week 13. But since his return from that 6-game suspension, he has had 18.1 or more fantasy points in 5 of his 6 performances and 13.6 in the 1 game where he did not have more than 18.1 fantasy points, and he still had a touchdown in that game as well. I mean, he's just playing great football. A little bit of a tough matchup, but this New England Patriots defense has not been playing as well as it was earlier in the season. We just talked about Stefon Diggs playing well against them. I think Hopkins is due for a ton of volume and another good fantasy stat line on Monday Night Football this week. All right, let's talk about Christian Kirk. I've got him as our wide receiver 9. We had him ranked pretty high last week. He showed up for us, 16.4 fantasy points against the Lions, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 104 receiving yards. Keep in mind, Trevor Lawrence, had to exit this game for a little bit, which I think could have hurt Christian Kirk's ultimate stat line. But at the end of the day, still a good stat line. He's your wide receiver 11 on the season so far. He gets the Tennessee Titans. This secondary is awful. AJ Brown and Devonta Smith just absolutely torched them this past week. An important game, once again, for both of these teams within this division. I expect Christian Kirk to have a good stat line here in week 14. All right, moving right along, I've got CeeDee Lamb. He might be a little bit lower than you'd like to see. He's your wide receiver 7 so far on the season. The reason why CeeDee Lamb, who is playing phenomenal football as of late, is a little bit lower for me is because I just don't know how much firepower the Cowboys are going to need to come out and have in this game against the Texans. I think they're going to run the football a lot. I think they're going to play great defense. I don't know how much they're really going to need to pass the football within this game, but ultimately CeeDee Lamb still brings a very solid floor and a good ceiling on the week. He's still a player we want to start in all scoring formats. 20.4 fantasy points in week 13, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 71 receiving yards, and a touchdown. That was his 4th best fantasy performance of the season against a good Colts secondary. I expect big things out of CeeDee Lamb and the Cowboys this week against the Houston Texans. I think he is perfectly fine as your wide receiver 10 as we approach the week. All right, moving right along, I've got Tyler Lockett as my wide receiver 11. He is your wide receiver 10 so far on the season. He gets the Carolina Panthers, a pretty solid matchup, and man, this Seahawks offense is just absolutely humming. I don't see any reason why they're going to take their foot off of the gas anytime soon. 27.8 fantasy points for Lockett in week 13. That was his season high. He is playing really good football. 12 targets, 9 receptions, 128 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Him and Geno Smith have beautiful, beautiful chemistry. Lockett should be in our starting lineup, so you could argue he should be a little bit higher on the rankings as well. Let's talk about DK Metcalf. 26.7 fantasy points in week 13, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 127 receiving yards, and a touchdown in the same matchup as Lockett, obviously with the same quarterback who's playing good football. The same offense that I said is humming right now. I like this Seahawks team. Metcalf is your wide receiver 15 so far on the season. I think he's going to put up another good stat line. He had a really good week in week 13 in a contestant game, surprisingly against the Rams in a heated game as well. Both Lockett and Metcalf should be in our lineups as we approach the week. All right, moving on to our wide receiver 13. I've got Jalen Waddle. He's a little bit lower than most of you guys are going to like to see. He's still your wide receiver 9 so far on the season after suffering an injury in week 13 against the Niners. Returning to the game, he only had 1 catch in this game for 9 receiving yards, so 1.9 fantasy points in week 13, playing through an injury against a very good Niners defense. He's still a top 10 receiver on the year, but at the moment he's questionable for the week. I just don't know how much this injury potentially limits Waddle, and it's a little bit of a tough matchup against the Chargers. I'm not too concerned about it. Ultimately, I still expect the Dolphins to have a good day, and if Waddle is good to go, I still think he is a player that we cannot afford to sit, but due to the injury and the matchup potentially limiting him, I've got him a little bit further back on the list as our wide receiver 13. Moving right along to our wide receiver 14, I've got Keenan Allen. He has looked good in his return, 12.4 points in week 11, 15.9 in week 12, and 20.8, a season high in week 13. 14 targets, 6 receptions, 88 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He is in the same matchup as Jalen Waddle, who we just talked about. Should be a lot of offense. Both of these teams throwing the football quite a bit. Keenan Allen should be the main beneficiary of that. Mike Williams is still coming in as questionable at the moment, which could definitely affect some of Keenan Allen's output if Mike Williams plays, that is. But I still think that Keenan Allen is the guy here for the Chargers. Brings a lot of consistency, a really safe floor, a good ceiling as well. Keenan Allen should be in our starting lineups as we approach the week. All right, wide receiver 15 overall, I've got Garrett Wilson. And guys, I really wanted to put Garrett Wilson higher on the list. He gets the Buffalo Bills. Not the best matchup, not the worst matchup. This defense was elite at the beginning of the season, and they kind of fizzled out, had some injuries, and now they're looking a little bit better as of late. But ultimately, Garrett Wilson's just getting a ton of volume with Mike White at the quarterback position for the Jets. He's looked fantastic in the last 2 weeks, and since week 8, he's had 17.5 or more fantasy points in every matchup except week 11 against the Patriots, and in that game, but there's neither offense showed up, right? But in the last 2 weeks, 24.2 or more fantasy points in his last 2 matchups. Week 13 alone, he had 162 receiving yards off of 8 receptions, 15 targets. Mike White trusts Garrett Wilson. They have a really good chemistry. Like I said, I would not be afraid to necessarily consider Garrett Wilson above some of the wide receivers who I have ranked above him on this list. He's playing really good football right now. All right, moving right along, I've got Chris Godwin as our wide receiver 16, 14.3 fantasy points in week 13 against the Saints, 13 targets, 8 receptions, 63 receiving yards. Did score a touchdown that got called back at the end of the game before Rachaad White scored the game-winning touchdown. So ultimately, this stat line could have been a little bit better. The nice thing that we've seen out of Godwin since week 10 that we weren't getting earlier in the season is some red zone targets and some touchdowns, right? Touchdown in week 10, on bye week in week 11, a touchdown in week 12. And then, like I said, in week 13, technically scored a touchdown that got called back. Doesn't help your fantasy team, but ultimately, it's still good to see that red zone chemistry from Brady to Godwin, right? So it's a tough matchup this week against the Niners. So I like Godwin as our wide receiver 16, but he's definitely still a wide receiver due to volume that we are starting on a weekly basis. Moving right along, I've got T. Higgins as my wide receiver 17, a little bit further back than he might like to see. And it's just so tough. Like I said, when we looked at the first 10 receivers for this list, they're all balling out. When we get to the next 10, all of these guys are balling out too. There's a lot of talent and a lot of fantasy production when it comes to the wide receiver position this year. Higgins is your wide receiver 14 so far on the year. 12.5 fantasy points in week 13 against the Kansas City Chiefs. 5 targets, 3 receptions, 35 receiving yards, and most importantly, a touchdown. He has 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, has 3 touchdowns in his last 5 games. Does Jamar Chase cap his ceiling a little bit? Sure, but ultimately, Higgins is still a player that we want to start and tied to one of the best offenses in the league as well. I love Higgins this week. Moving right along to your wide receiver 18, I've got Amari Cooper, who is your wide receiver 12 so far on the year. But I just don't know how to get a full grasp on this Browns unit with Deshaun Watson at the quarterback position. Obviously, Watson struggled in his season opener against the Texans last week. I don't want to say the offense struggled, but they kind of did, right? And this is still a team that's going to run the football first. This team played very well against the Bengals in week 8, but Jacoby Brissett was a quarterback, right? And Amari Cooper played very well in that game, but I don't know what he's going to do this week with Deshaun Watson at the quarterback position. Game is at Cincinnati. Unlike the last time these two teams played, which was in Cleveland, it's a little bit of a tough situation to read at the moment. I still like Cooper. We're still starting Cooper, but we need to get a better read of what things are going to look like with Watson at the quarterback position. When we look at the receivers in front of him, I ultimately think they hold more upside. All right, moving right along, I've got Hollywood Brown as our wide receiver 19, receiver that was playing phenomenal football through the first 6 weeks of the season before getting hurt. Made his return in week 12, 10.6 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 46 receiving yards against the Chargers, and was on bye last week. Tough matchup against the New England Patriots this week. But like we talked about with DeAndre Hopkins, the Patriots have been kind of struggling defensively in comparison to the beginning of the season. And ultimately, the nice thing with Hopkins back out there is that Hopkins is going to take the majority of the defensive pressure, right? And then Hollywood Brown should be able to get loose on a couple of plays. So I think that Brown, has a nice ceiling and a very safe floor as we approach week 14. I don't want you guys to forget about Hollywood Brown. I think he's had time to rest through the bye, and I really believe that he is still Kyler's favorite target at the wide receiver position. So I think that Hollywood Brown is due for a good week. Moving right along, I've got Devonta Smith. Might be a little bit higher for most of your guys' likings, but he's your wide receiver 21 so far on the season. Don't forget, we've got 6 teams on bye this week. So I think Smith as our wide receiver 20 actually makes a lot of sense. 21.2 fantasy points in week 13 against the Tennessee Titans. That was his second best fantasy performance of the season. 8 targets, 5 receptions, 102 receiving yards, and a touchdown. An important game this week against the Giants. I think he's going to have a good week. I think this Eagles offense is just too good to ignore. Is Devonta Smith a little bit better suited as a flex player for your roster? Probably, because he still brings a lot of boomer bust potential. Do I still like Devonta Smith a lot this week? Absolutely. All right, moving right along, I've got Brandon Ayuk as our wide receiver 21. He's your wide receiver 18 so far on the season. Gets a change at quarterback. Brock Purdy is going to be out there. Purdy played pretty well in week 13. 210 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, a pick, 37 passing attempts, and 25 completions. A little bit of a tougher matchup this week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But ultimately, even if I think, this offense's ceiling is a little bit capped, I like Ayuk. Just a safe floor on a weekly basis. Just a player who fills in really nicely as a wide receiver 2 or flex for your fantasy rosters in full PPR. So I think Ayuk is a good start. I've got him as our wide receiver 21. Mike Evans is our wide receiver 22, has really fallen back ultimately in fantasy production. There's a couple guys behind him on the list that you could argue should be in front of him. Evans is your wide receiver 23 so far on the season. He gets a tough matchup against the Niners. In the last 4 weeks, he's had 10.4 or less fantasy points. Ultimately, he should continue to hopefully see some better volume. He did not see it in week 13, but at the end of the day, the Buccaneers offense plays from behind and they throw the football a lot. I expect him to be playing from behind and throwing the football a lot against a stout Niners unit. Be a little bit concerned about potentially starting Mike Evans if you have other options that you like. So at the end of the day, he's a little bit further back on the list. Deebo Samuel's also a little bit further back on the list. He's your wide receiver 24 so far on the year, though. 12.3 fantasy points in week 13, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 58 receiving yards. He also gets he changed at quarterback. Similar to Brandon Ayuk, I don't exactly know how to get a full read on this offense yet, but Purdy did look pretty good last week like we talked about. It's a tough defense to run against, so that should benefit Ayuk and Deebo Samuel. I think he fits in nicely as our wide receiver 23. DJ Moore is my wide receiver 24. He comes in as your wide receiver 30 so far on the year. We know that Sam Darnold will be the starting quarterback for the Panthers. This is the 3rd quarterback that DJ Moore has had throwing to him so far on the season. And in week 12, he had 20.3 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 103 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Was on bye week in week 13. But it just feels like the Panthers and Sam Darnold especially feel like they have nothing to lose. I expect some deep balls to DJ Moore. It is worth noting that the Seahawks are pretty good against opposing wide receivers, but I think that DJ Moore is still a receiver due to volume that we can start on the week. Next up, I've got Jerry Jeudy against the Chiefs. He is the receiver on the Broncos that I want to start this week because I think he brings a little bit better upside than Courtland Sutton, and Sutton is dealing with a hamstring injury, is considered day to day. Jeudy had 10.5 fantasy points in week 13 against the Ravens, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 65 receiving yards. So not a lot of his, ceiling involved there. But when we looked earlier on the season when he was healthy, he was the receiver between him and Sutton on this atrocious offense that was at least bringing a little bit of a better ceiling. And ultimately, it's still a good matchup against a Chiefs secondary that has not played well against the wide receiver position. But man, do I want to start a player on the Broncos offense on my fantasy roster? Not necessarily. Moving right along, I've got George Pickens, who really disappointed me, guys. I mean, extremely disappointed me in week 13 against the Atlanta Falcons. I had him pretty high on the rankings. I encourage you guys to start George Pickens last week. I thought it was a really good matchup. I thought he had been looking really good the previous 3 weeks or so. But 1.2 fantasy points, 2 targets, 1 reception, 2 receiving yards. Obviously, some frustration from Pickens coming off of the field at certain times in this game. Overall, I expect the Steelers to continue to try and get Pickens the football. The Ravens secondary, from a fantasy perspective, has actually struggled on the season, although they have plenty of playmakers within that defense. And that defense has looked a little bit stouter as of late in comparison to the beginning of the season. It was a tough read with Kenny Pickett at quarterback. He was definitely shown some glimpses of what he's going to be able to do in this league, but has also struggled at times as well. So I don't exactly know how to read Pickens this week. I think he's no more than a flex play. And ultimately, while I still like Pickens as the main receiving option for the Steelers, I think he brings a much higher ceiling than Deontay Johnson. It's still a little bit of a tough read. He's a little bit further back as our wide receiver 26. All right, another receiver I liked last week that gave us an awful performance was Zay Jones. 3.6 fantasy points in week 13 against the Lions. 7 targets, 2 receptions, 16 receiving yards. I thought he'd be a really good flex for you guys last week. He did not show up, but ultimately he gets the Tennessee Titans secondary this week, and they're awful against the wide receiver position. I think that Zay Jones is a receiver we can, try and gain some trust in again here in week 14. I think he is a player who can still be considered a starter as we approach the week. Moving right along, at wide receiver 28, I've got Josh Palmer. When we talked about Keenan Allen, we mentioned Mike Williams might play this week. He might not. That would affect, the potential production for Josh Palmer if Mike Williams is out there. Ultimately, Josh Palmer has still brought some consistency to the table since week 9. Outside of week 10, he has had 10.6 or more fantasy points in every single game. In week 10, he had just 7.4. But ultimately, the Chargers find themselves in positions where they need to throw the football, and it looks like Palmer is gaining good enough volume to start him in the flex or even consider him as a wide receiver 2 in PPR on a weekly basis. But if you do own Palmer, just keep an eye on Mike Williams. And ultimately, against the Miami Dolphins in a good offensive game script, I've got Josh Palmer in the top 30 as our wide receiver 28. All right, we briefly talked about Deontay Johnson already. Listen, I think Pickens brings the upside at the wide receiver position for the Steelers, but Deontay Johnson still brings a really safe floor on a weekly basis and still has a pretty good matchup against the Baltimore Ravens secondary. So I think that Deontay Johnson in full PPR, you can start, but don't expect more than 11 or 12 points as we approach the week. Last on the list, I've got Adam Thielen. He comes in as your wide receiver 31. He's been very inconsistent when we look since week 8. 12.7 in week 8, 21.1 in week 12. Outside of that, 9.9 or less fantasy points in every other matchup. But he gets a good matchup, a good game script, an important game here in week 14 against the Detroit Lions. I think that Thielen can absolutely show up. I think he's worth a flex option as we approach the week, even coming off of a poor performance with just 4.7 points in week 13. Ultimately, I still like this Vikings offense, and I love this game script and this matchup against the Detroit Lions as we approach week 14. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.